Screams. Screams of terror. The boat I'm on rocks into a violent pitch as we slam into another wave. Salty spray stings my face. And in my arms, Addie, my 15-month-old daughter, is screaming. All around me, people are shrieking and yelping, clutching their seats so as not to be thrown overboard. I hug my daughter tight, and I tell her I love her. Everything is going to be okay. I should back up. In February 2012, I went to Cartagena, Colombia with my wife, Bridget, her parents, Pat and Mary, and the aforementioned 15-month-old Addie. I know when you hear Cartagena, you immediately think of the boom of the cocaine business or some back alley port city smuggling ring, but Cartagena has actually become a beautiful cosmopolitan city, boasting bustling modern neighborhoods and picturesque old city dotted with cobblestone plazas and historic churches. So yes, we took a toddler and 2 senior citizens to Cartagena. Bridget had been to Cartagena before, a decade earlier, with one of her best friends who has family in the city. It was a trip full of dancing the mapole, drinking rum, and getting into the kind of trouble that wives don't tell their husbands. And so the events that would lead us to that boat began with a memory of Playa Blanca, a pristine stretch of beach a short distance from the city, a memory of umbrella-covered chaise lounges on the edge of the Caribbean, a cool sea breeze blowing across skin warmed by the tropical sun, sand as white and fine as confectioner sugar, or cocaine, water in ever-shifting myriad of blues and greens that you thought only existed in the paint store with names like deep azure, misty teal, and sapphire lace. A memory of paradise. Or at least one definition of paradise, not mine. I hate sand, I hate hot weather, I hate the sun. A guy with my complexion can't afford not to. I'm a skin cancer magnet. And most importantly, I hate any body of water that is home to sharks, and most that aren't, because you just never know. But Bridget's memory of Playa Blanca put it high on the to-do list, and I know how to pick my battles. We would come to find that sometimes memory just likes to mess with you. On the day of our trip, we arrived at the dock in the early morning and waited as one by one, groups of 30 to 40 people were called to the 20 or so boats that would taxi them to the beach. The dock was a hot slab of concrete, slowly baking in the morning sun, and we waited and waited. Addie got fussy, too much staying in one place for a toddler. I became acutely aware of the fact that we were a mere 715 miles from the equator. The boat, once we were finally called, posed its own set of challenges. My father-in-law has some mobility issues, so he had a hard time stepping down from the dock into the ship, and once aboard, we discovered that there were no child life vests. In the U.S., this would have been probably a violation of some rule or ordinance, but we were in Colombia, which, despite all of its beauty and first world amenities, is still el segundo mundo. The boat took us through the harbor and out into the sea, cutting along the coast to get to Playa Blanca. But when we arrived, that's when memory really started to mess with us, because there was no dock. The boat simply beached itself on the shore, and everyone jumped down 5 feet into a foot or 2 of surf. And remember, Bridget had taken this trip as a 25-year-old, and what was probably a minor detail became a major issue when you're with your 7 and 1-year-old parents who don't get around so well, and a 15-month-old who has a tenuous grasp on walking. With some extra help from the crew, we somehow made it off the boat without incident, but I had started to doubt my wife. How could she have thought this trip was a good idea? It's not kid-friendly. Hell, it's not parent-friendly. Why would she have put us in this ridiculous situation? I was angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry, because I get very, very grumpy. I was determined not to have a good time, and so for the next few hours, as the rest of my family played in the surf and explored the beach, I stayed parked in our little cabana, reading a guidebook, making mental notes of all the places we could have gone to with things like stroller parking and handicapped access. I was no happier when our promised lunch of fried fish arrived, and it was literally a whole fish fried. I had no doubt that it was fresh, probably hooked on the line that very morning, but I have a hard time eating food that is looking at me. I watched my daughter scream and giggle in the surf. The water looked nice, refreshing even, but, you know, sharks. To get back on the boat, we had to wade out into the surf and climb aboard. Pat and Mary were unceremoniously scooped up and tossed onto the boat of the ship, and had to work their way down the narrow aisle of the ship as it rocked gently in the surf. And by rock gently, I mean it was tossing my in-laws from side to side, bumping into fellow passengers. My wife sat in the outside seat of our tiny bench, and I opted for the aisle seat. Addie's head was already resting on my shoulder. After an afternoon in the sun and water, she was passed out. We pushed back into the sea and headed for home. And then the terror began. Our young crew were an adventurous lot, and they weren't just in the water taxi business. I think they fancied themselves entertainers. Sure, you could drive the ship from point A to point B, and if the weather holds, you could have a good enough time. But what if you could give them something to remember? There's a stretch of sea far enough away from Playa Blanca, and yet not close enough to the wake-free rules of the harbor that will be forever seared in my memory, because that's when the immortality of youth came crashing into the harsh realities of parenthood. The captain of the ship stepped on the gas, or whatever you do to make a boat go faster. We zoomed forward and rocketed off the next wave, catching air until gravity slammed us back to the water. We did it again. This time, the moment where we were immune from gravity's effects lasted even longer, and the landing splashed seawater into our faces. My daughter woke up and screamed in terror. She didn't have a mastery of language back then, but I can only imagine what she was thinking. What the fuck is going on? The rest of the passengers were laughing and hooting, including my in-laws, including my wife. But me, I was having a father's worst nightmare. As the waves and the jumps got higher, I held Addie tight, really tight, because every time we caught air and we had that feeling of weightlessness, I was certain she was going to slip from my arms, or that the next wave might capsize the boat, throwing us into the sea. It was like riding a roller coaster with no lap bar, and my daughter, who cannot swim, had no life vest. If she went overboard, she would sink straight to the bottom, unless the sharks got her first, because it always comes back to sharks. I hooked my foot under the seat in front of me to keep myself planted. I scanned the coast for a point to swim to if the boat were to capsize. Maybe I could float with Addie to shore. My wife would be fine. My in-laws had had terrific lives. But the nearest shore was rocky, and I knew I'd be broken on the rocks. No, I'd have to swim farther if I was going to get to land and save my daughter, who, meanwhile, was still screaming, except not like before. It was scream, then a laugh, then a scream, and then another laugh. These weren't screams of terror, they were screams of delight. She was having a blast. Every time the sea spray washed our faces, she would cackle. Every moment of weightlessness stretched the smile across her face even wider. She wasn't scared, or at least no more scared than someone who enters a haunted house but knows the ghosts aren't real. It was the thrill of fear without any understanding of the danger. It was a sense of immortality. And I thought, when did I get so old? There was a time when this kind of thing would have brought me the same adrenaline rush of excitement. But here I was, terrified of losing my grip, of losing my daughter. I have no idea how long that went on. It could have been 5 minutes or a half an hour. But eventually we made it to the harbor, and everyone laughed and joked as we slowed in the no-wake zone. I felt it was safe enough to hand Addie to my wife. My fingers hurt from clutching her so hard. Of course, she just wanted to lean over the boat and watch the water go by. I'm not an overprotective parent, and I do look forward to riding roller coasters with my daughter someday, but this was too much. I knew there was no safety net, and being responsible for another human being, well, it wasn't fun. It was scary, and it was real. I started to calm down. The danger for that moment was over, and I could start thinking about the future again, and not one that ended in a watery grave. Slowly, that sense of fun returned. Maybe tomorrow we'd climb up to El Castillo on the hill and stand on its dizzying towers, looking over the entire city. Yeah, maybe I could find a way to have fun again, but not until I get off this fucking boat.